Welcome to the Streets.mn podcast, the show where we highlight how transportation and land use can make our communities better places. Coming to you from the beautiful Wedge neighborhood of Minneapolis, Minnesota, I am your host, Ian R. Buck. Did you know that the Minnesota Star Tribune isn't just a newspaper anymore? They have a few podcasts as well. I recently enjoyed their 6-part series, Ghost of a Chance, in which reporter Eric Roper became obsessed with researching a couple of previous owners of his house in South Minneapolis. Harry and Clementine Robinson were some of the first black homeowners in the area, and their story illuminates a lot about Minneapolis history. You're about to hear the first 2 episodes, and if you want to hear the rest of the series, find the link in the show notes. Enjoy!
For more than 4 years, Eric's been searching for every detail he can find about the Robinsons and understanding how their story tells a hidden history of Minneapolis. And that's when this became an official Star Tribune project. And I came on board to help Eric turn his search into this podcast.
You're listening to Ghost of a Chance from the Minnesota Star Tribune. This is the story of my search to find out what happened to Harry and Clementine Robinson. I'm Eric Roper.
I'm Melissa Townsend.
This is episode 1.
The first question Eric had was, who were Harry and Clementine? And the second question was, what brought them to Minnesota? To find out, Eric had to go all the way back to the beginning of their story. Most people have heard of the Great Migration, the wave of African Americans who moved north between roughly 1910 and 1970. People were escaping Jim Crow in the South and looking for a more stable life with better jobs, better schooling, better places to live. But many people don't know that well before this Great Migration, there were smaller waves of African Americans moving around the country, and some of them made their way to Minnesota. Not very many, but some. Eric found out that the Minnesota Historical Society had a whole collection of old interviews of people who were part of these migrations. So he started listening.
It sort of blew my mind just hearing these people talk, they've passed away a long time ago and they're telling us their experiences.
My name is Raymond Winfred Cannon, C-A-N.
He heard Raymond Winfred Cannon. He said his family were free people in North Carolina, but they could see that the Civil War was coming. So they moved to Minnesota before it was even a state.
Do you know why he happened to choose Minnesota? They were going as far north as they could get. I think that was the idea that they had in mind at that time.
As far north as they could get. Eric found another interview from a woman named Marvell Cook.
Marvell Cook's family moved to Minnesota around 1900.
My father felt that there were many opportunities there. The university was there, and he bought a piece of property there and built a beautiful house, which we grew up in, very close to the Mississippi River. And it was just lovely.
So Marvell's family moved because they thought there were opportunities in Minnesota. Eric searched high and low for a recording of Harry and Clementine Robinson, and he came up empty. So he really needed to figure out for himself, who were they and what brought them to Minnesota? He says part of his search started on a popular genealogy website.
So Ancestry.com, obviously a very powerful database, and you have to start by building a family tree. So I have a whole house history family tree, and Clementine, she gets a profile. Okay, now we're going to start building in, between newspaper clips, census records, whatever we can find.
Luckily, Eric found a record of Clementine's brother. His name was Gideon Brown. And through him, he was able to locate Clementine's birthplace.
I found out that Clementine was born in this small rural town north of Kansas City, Missouri, called Mecca, or Shady Grove.
Eric found there wasn't much online about this town, so he went there.
And so we are sort of driving through farmland, rolling countryside. It's very beautiful out here, very beautiful day. And I can see that we're approaching the lake, which means that we're close to Mecca Cemetery.
Eric learned that in the 1970s, after many families had already left Mecca, the Army Corps of Engineers flooded the town to make a lake, Smithville Lake. The town had shrunk to just a few residents, but still, some were very unhappy about their town being wiped out.
So let's go maybe like over here. I feel like I can hear it more.
All that's left of Mecca is the Black Cemetery. So Eric went there to see if he could find out more about Clementine's family. He met up with a woman named Gwen Green. Her great-grandfather grew up alongside Clementine, here in the 1880s and 90s.
Do you see why they would call this Mecca? It's quiet, serene, calming. I don't know. I just feel the spirits here.
It's very, the fact that it's closed off and
Right.
it's very pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
After they left the cemetery, Gwen and Eric went somewhere where they could talk. Gwen had some records about Clementine's family.
Yes, this is from 1885. I was told they'd taken kids that were being abandoned. Like if one of the parents died, then the Estes family would keep them for a while until they found a home for them to go to.
Clementine's mother, Laura, she was Laura Estes, so she came from that family.
Right.
Before the Civil War, Missouri was a slave state. Many of the people in the Black community there today are descendants of slaves, including Gwen's family. With Gwen's help and his own sleuthing, Eric was able to piece together Clementine's family history. And he found out she was the first generation in her family born free in the United States.
As far as I can tell, and these records are notoriously difficult to find, Clementine's father was born in Kentucky, and I presume that he was enslaved there.
Something like 20% of the Black population of Kentucky leaves in the first year after the war. Most of them are driven out by violence.
Eric and I reached out to an historian named Chris Phillips. He's done quite a bit of research into what happened in this region right after the Civil War ended.
We have lots of descriptions of the roads filled with Black people just trying to flee Klan violence.
Eric found that by 1870, Clementine's father was living in Mecca, Missouri. He was a farmer and a Baptist minister. Clementine's mother had a very different story.
Clementine's mother was probably born into slavery as a baby, but soon after that became free because her father, Clementine's grandfather, was freed in 1854, before emancipation.
Eric knows that Clementine's grandfather was freed because he actually found the will that freed him. It's written by the slave owner Thomas Estes, and he is freeing Washington Estes. That's Clementine's grandfather.
My Negro man Washington, about 27 years old, I will to be free on the first day of April, A.D. 1854.
Just 5 words that changed the lives of every generation after. I will to be free. Eric also pieced together Harry Robinson's family story, and he was also the first generation in his family born free. But he was not raised in Missouri like Clementine.
Yeah, he's from a small railroad town called Mitchell in southern Indiana. Both his parents were enslaved in Kentucky, just like Clementine's father, and they were both freed by the 13th Amendment and then fled Kentucky and moved to Indiana.
So Eric headed to Mitchell, Indiana, to learn more about Harry's life before he moved to Minnesota. And there he met a man named Jeff Routh. Jeff Routh works at the Lawrence County Museum of History. Mitchell is in Lawrence County.
Immediately following the Civil War.
Why would a family come to Mitchell in particular, do you think? And this is a railroad town, right?
From what I've been able to learn, Mitchell was the first place north of Louisville, Kentucky, that a Black person could get off the railroad and feel welcome. If you went to Washington County, which is the next county southeast of here, they had basically the sundown laws. You know, they could be there during the daylight, but if they were there at night, they were fair game.
I mean, think about those words, fair game. This is a really dangerous landscape that Harry's family is walking into, and they're just trying to find the safest place to put down roots and make a life. But it's really difficult. And this is where Harry is born.
Jeff had found an old newspaper article describing Harry's father.
It says he was tall and well-built, a whitewasher by trade, a Baptist by religion, and Republican in politics. Industrious, good-natured, and honest.
So at this point, even though Harry was in Indiana and Clementine was in Missouri, Eric could see that they had a lot in common.
It's sort of weird how much they had in common. They claimed to both be born on the very same date, May 2nd, 1881. And they were both from large families. Clementine was one of 18 children, and both their fathers were preachers, Baptist preachers.
And Eric and I both wanted to know, what was it like to be part of that first generation of Black citizens born free in the United States?
You're not property anymore. That's a very different disposition on life.
Brandon Jones is a therapist we talked to. He's based in Minneapolis, and he has a particular focus on intergenerational trauma.
You also have opportunity to experience some of what you couldn't do before. Like you could read, you could go to school, you could travel without papers. And now you might not have the same opportunity or access as a white family at that time may have had, but you had an opportunity. Like that had to be a different experience.
But at the same time, Brandon told us that the expectation was that Black people would, quote unquote, know their place.
Stay out of trouble, keep your head down, don't make eye contact, don't let anyone know that you are smarter than you are because you may be considered a danger because you're getting uppity or too lippy.
So Brandon told us there was this tension between knowing your place and standing your ground.
That's kind of the tug of war that many Black people had to face during that time period of the Jim Crow era, trying to have a life where you can have some joy, but also having these social barriers and levels of racism that keeps you from fully experiencing this American dream, so to say.
So how did Harry and Clementine manage this tug of war between the racism that was keeping them down and the freedom that was giving them wings? And what does any of this have to do with Minnesota? When Eric was in Missouri with Gwen Green, she told him that Clementine wouldn't have had much of a future if she had stayed in that small town.
I think that they wanted to, make something of themselves. If they stayed in Mecca, there's nothing there for them but domestic work or farming. I think that they wanted to venture out and see what was out there.
And so he went off to figure out when Clementine left. And he told me for this he needed to use both the census and old city directories. And I said, what's a city directory?
Yeah, they don't exist anymore. City directories are a lot like phone books, except that they list your occupation and they list your address. A lot of which have also been digitized now, so we can do searches for people, addresses, and other things.
And this is where Eric found Clementine, in official documents from 1900.
She's living in Kansas City, and she's a domestic servant, also described as a nurse girl. And we can see that in the city directory, she's got different addresses almost every year.
So Clementine had flown the nest by the time she was 19 years old. She had moved about 30 miles away to find new opportunities. But Eric found Harry's path to leaving his hometown was a little more complicated. The urge to uproot may have come from a tragic accident that happened when he was just a boy.
The historians in Lawrence County helped me locate this article in the Indianapolis Journal newspaper from 1890. When Harry was about 9 years old, he and his entire family became essentially poisoned by accident after rat poison sifted off a shelf into their dinner. And Harry's father died.
It was a tragedy, but Eric found it wasn't rare.
The poison powder that the Robinsons had accidentally eaten was called Rough on Rats, and like other rat poisons of the era, it was made with arsenic. Arsenic has no distinguishing taste, so it becomes notorious for accidental poisonings in this era, In another case in Indiana around this time, a man died after making gravy. Turns out he had mistakenly mixed in rat poison, thinking that it was flour.
Harry's father died on February 4th, 1890. We asked that therapist, Brandon Jones, how did he think that would have affected Harry?
You see a parent lose their life, it's going to leave an imprint on you, no matter how old you are or the parent is. To die from something that's preventable, like rat poisoning, that can be pretty traumatic for Harry.
Brandon says sometimes something this traumatic can sink a young person. It can bring on depression and anxiety. But other times, it can have a different effect.
It probably motivated him to, do as much as he can, because you don't know how long you have to live in this world, which is not uncommon for a lot of Black men to think.
In other words, Harry may have gotten the message that life is short, use your gifts, shoot your shot.
I found all these newspaper clippings from the local newspapers in Mitchell, Indiana from Harry's high school years. And this is right before the turn of the century in 1899, 1900. And he's a local superstar. Throughout Harry's senior year, it's noting that he's kind of a leader in the class, like he's among the top of the class. And then it kind of culminates with him being the top of the class, getting the top honors of the class, the valedictorian. And so this gets him a special thing. This means that he actually receives a scholarship to a law school.
Eric learned that at the time, the Nashville College of Law was offering scholarships to promising students in communities around the country. So as valedictorian in Mitchell, Indiana, Harry won that scholarship. People in Mitchell, Indiana are still proud of Harry. Marla Jones works alongside Jeff Routh at the Lawrence County Museum of History. Again, Mitchell is in Lawrence County.
He was excelling in every way. And that very much impresses me that, time or situation wouldn't hold that boy down, that he was going to do big things. It shows he has a lot of moxie.
In 1900, Harry Robinson was on his way to becoming a lawyer. It was a huge accomplishment. But Harry never went to law school. Eric found an announcement in the local newspaper, dated 3 weeks after Harry's graduation ceremony.
And it's a picture of Harry. It's on the top of the front page of the paper, and it says Harry Robinson, the Mitchell colored boy who won the scholarship offered by the Nashville, Tennessee Law School and was turned down on account of his color.
On account of his color. The law school did not accept Black students. Marla Jones.
The elation turned to disappointment must have been palpable. I mean, I can't imagine.
Harry Robinson was a 19-year-old young Black man from a small town in Indiana. Eric wondered, what did this tell him about the world?
It says, come here, come here.
Resma Menicum is another therapist we talked to. He's a best-selling author based in Minneapolis.
This is how you make it. Come here. You may be able, from your hard work, be able to achieve some things. But when you get there, you find out that you can't have access to the things that you thought you could have access to. And you've played the game the way that they said you should play the game. And it's still not enough.
That summer, Harry left Mitchell, Indiana. It looks like he moved around the Midwest for a while. And then in 1907, he landed in Kansas City, Missouri. And that's where he met a young woman named Clementine Brown.
She's living in this boarding house at 1107 Harrison Street. And who else is living in this boarding house? Harry Robinson.
Eric likes to imagine the scene where they struck up their first conversation.
In my imagination, they're both working hard jobs, and you're coming home and you're sort of taking a load off. You get to know people. And they clearly made a connection. If they were actually born on the same date, I'm thinking that's the connection. Like, oh, actually, Hello, we were both born on the same day. I mean, if I was single and I met someone who had my same birth date, I'd at least have a conversation with them. So, oh my God, we have the same birthday. Oh, we were born in the same year. And then it's just like love ever after that, right? Like they're soulmates, right?
Theoretically. But racial tension was ratcheting up in Kansas City. Historian Chris Phillips.
It becomes the Confederate capital of Missouri at about that point, meaning that all of these ex-Confederates rise through the system. They become political leaders. They create their own cemeteries. They glorify the lost cause. And so if you're black in Kansas City at that moment, before the Great Migration, it's a really tenuous place to be and moment to be there.
So Harry and Clementine hatched a plan to move to Minnesota. Maybe Harry planned to enroll at the University of Minnesota. There were some black students there at the time. And Eric found that Clementine seemed to have her own plan.
She had been a domestic servant her whole working life, and so she makes this stop on her way to the Twin Cities in Chicago, and it looks like she enrolled in the Moeller School of Dermatology. It's a course that lasts a few weeks, and you would learn in this course about, hairdressing, facial massage, electrolysis, all sorts of things, but they're all in the realm of hair care and beauty.
Historian Tiffany Gill has written about black women in the beauty industry in the early 1900s. We called her to get an idea of what Clementine was doing here.
She really is at the very first wave of black women entering into formal beauty work. And there were not many black women-owned beauty colleges that she would have been able to attend. And so she went to the Moeller School, which was a way of teaching black women, along with white women, the trade of beauty work.
So what I sort of take away from this is that she's not just moving out of Kansas City, but she's trying to move up in the world. And maybe there's this impression that Minnesota is sort of a barrier-free place. I mean, it's all the way almost as far north as you can get.
What would Harry and Clementine find in Minnesota? When Eric started his search to find out what happened to Harry and Clementine Robinson once they arrived in Minneapolis, he realized the local mainstream newspapers didn't cover the black community here very much. But lucky for him, the black newspapers from the 1900s had recently been digitized. They were online, and they were a goldmine. In 1908, there was a black newspaper published in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was called The Appeal. It was one of the premier black newspapers in the Midwest.
The Appeal and the other black newspapers like it were sort of like my time machine into this period to sort of hear what are people saying. We can see both national news and also opinionated editorials.
The editor of The Appeal at the time was a man named J.Q. Adams. And J.Q. Adams had a daughter. Her name was Adina Gibbs. This is an old recording of her, part of a set of oral histories at the Minnesota Historical Society. And she's talking about why her father published The Appeal.
My father wanted so much to educate colored people to be decent, to be upright. He always wanted them to appear in a right light. I have recollections of his telling them when they were in groups that they didn't behave themselves. He just tell them, well, don't act like this. Don't let these people see you acting like this.
Newspapers defined respectability.
Bill Green is an historian based in the Twin Cities.
That's one source of knowing what we need to do in order to be respectable. And that's one reason why they were so important to the black community.
You see a lot of images of people's houses on occasion. Today, we would find that very odd to just put a bunch of people's houses in the paper, but it's sort of a celebration of here's who we are, here's where we live, here's what we have accomplished.
And then there are the social pages.
When you read it, it's like social media today, with people tagging where they are, who they're with, what they're doing.
We asked a man named John Coleman to read the headlines from the black newspapers. He's a voice actor based in Minneapolis.
The May party given by Madam Nellie Hale McCullough at Holcomb Hall Wednesday night was a most delightful affair which was well attended. Miss Bertha Clay was crowned Queen of May.
If you were hoping to aspire to the middle class, like we think Harry and Clementine were, the paper told you how you needed to present yourself. And so it's a good sign that after Clementine finished her course at the Moeller School of Dermatology and joined Harry in St. Paul, it was posted in the Appeal newspaper.
It's dated May 2nd, 1908. And this is kind of a cosmic date that we see throughout the story because that was Harry and Clementine's shared birthday.
Miss Clementine Brown, a graduate of Moeller College of Dermatology, Chicago, is in the city, the guest of Mrs. Willis Green. She contemplates following her profession if the field looks good.
So then I found a marriage certificate that showed that just a month after Clementine arrived in Minnesota, she and Harry got married.
And for a long time, that's where their trail ended. Eric knew they would end up in his house in 1917, but he didn't know how they got there.
I'm searching online for quite some time, and finally, I found some clips in the Twin Cities Star newspaper saying Mr. and Mrs. Robinson of Duluth are visiting some friends. And then I think, well, that's interesting, and I start to poke around Duluth more, and I find a Harry Robinson in the city directory, and he's working as a chef, and he's also listed as working as a cook. And he's living right next to the primary black church of Duluth.
So he found Harry Robinson, but Eric still couldn't find Clementine.
I had tried like Clementine Robinson, Harry Robinson, looking keyword searches. I'm getting really nothing. I'm getting some other Harry Robinsons. Then I start seeing, though, C.H. Robinson, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting because Clementine went by C.H. Once in a while later on. And then I look at these classified ads, and it's like Mrs. C.H. Robinson is a dermatologist. Okay.
Mrs. C.H. Robinson, graduate of dermatology, to do your hairdressing, manicuring, hand massage, facial massage, shampooing, singeing, dyeing, and bleaching. Scalp treatment a specialty. Special attention to residents and hotel calls.
So Eric actually dug up a textbook from the Moeller School of Dermatology to figure out if there was a match between what Clementine learned in school and the services offered in these classified ads. He really wanted to be sure this was Clementine.
She's doing everything. It's like almost like chapter by chapter. It's the hair singeing, the bleaching. I mean, everything one by one, it's matching up with that textbook. And I'm like, okay, got it. And I knew for sure that they were living in Duluth.
Now, for those of you not in Minnesota, Duluth is a small city in northern Minnesota right on the shores of Lake Superior. It's about 90 miles to the Canadian border as the crow flies. When Eric told me Harry and Clementine were in Duluth, I was like, why? What's in Duluth that would draw a young black couple in 1908?
Duluth is a boom town in this period, basically. In addition to sawmilling, which is a huge industry, and lumber, you have one of the largest reserves of iron ore in the country is on the Iron Range of northern Minnesota. And there's a lot of foreign-born people living there. For example, you have a lot of Finnish immigrants who are arriving there, and sometimes it's known as the Helsinki of America. And this stuff gets shipped out to the rest of the country through the port of Duluth. And so what you have are iron mining magnates, steel magnates. There's a saying around Duluth that it had the most millionaires per capita in the United States.
Eric knew a lot about Duluth, but what he didn't know was what it was like to live there as a black person in the early 1900s. And this is when Eric began to see a side of Minnesota that he never knew.
I found this old recording of a woman named Ethel Nance. She was a black woman who grew up in Duluth. And when I checked the city directories, I realized that Harry and Clementine moved into the neighborhood where she grew up. She said her father worked on the boats at the port and in the hotels in town. And in this old recording, she talked about the time that he bought their first house in Duluth.
He came down and was walking around the back of the house, and the neighbor woman came to her door and stood there with her arms akimbo. And he said he purposely walked slowly to give her a chance to really get riled up. And when he came up close enough, she said, I hope you don't think you're going to live there. And he said, well, I was thinking about it, but he didn't tell her he already owned the place.
Ethel said once her family moved in, the neighbors didn't become any more friendly. Neighbors on one side of the house built a fence that she called a spite fence. The only thing you could see out the windows of the house was the fence. So her father built another story onto the house to see above the fence. But then the neighbors on the other side of the house sabotaged their drain pipe.
But it was raining, and I came in and said, Mrs. Rickard moved the water pipe. At that time, we had a family living in the basement, and it meant by turning that water pipe, the water would go into a window.
You know, I've heard a lot about the history of Duluth. I hadn't heard about the attitudes that Black people were putting up with. I'm sure that has like a powerful impact on people's psyche over times in neighborhoods like this.
In that recording, Ethel Nance said it did have an impact on her father.
Well, he'd always said that these people were antagonistic and didn't want us there. And he didn't want us to run errands or do anything at all for them, and really didn't want us to talk to them.
There's a book that came out in 2022 that includes some of this history. It's written by a man named Chad Montree. So Eric reached out to him, and he asked, what should I know about the experience of Black residents who were living in Duluth in the early 1900s? And Chad said, at the time, Duluth was very racially segregated, and where you could live, where you could socialize, where you could work.
A lot of them work as waiters, or they work as elevator operators or custodians. Whites do not let them have access to most other jobs.
Now, obviously, this is commonplace in the Jim Crow South, but Harry and Clementine, you know, they moved north to get away from that, and Minnesota was supposed to be different.
Eric knew that in southern states from Maryland to Texas, there were Jim Crow laws that required racially segregated schools, railroad cars, parks, even jails. Many states made interracial marriage illegal. But he also knew that that wasn't the case in Minnesota. In fact, at the time, there was a law on the books that made it illegal to discriminate against Black people in public places. So Eric asked historian Bill Green about it. And Bill said it was a paradox, not just in Duluth, but across Minnesota.
There are two Minnesotans, one that is high-minded and liberal, and coexisting at that time, there's another group of whites who are anything but, and they tend to be in the majority. They seemed to elect progressive leaders, but it didn't really relate to them being progressive towards Blacks. Discrimination was widespread. Blacks couldn't go into hotels, couldn't go into restaurants, despite the fact that Minnesota had a law banning that kind of behavior.
Chad Montree said, yeah, just look at what happened between white settlers and the indigenous people from the region. There was a war in 1862 between U.S. forces and the Dakota in Minnesota. Chad said that sharpened the racism that then would be aimed at newly arrived Black residents.
So, and I think the Dakota War is in my book because that's the context for whites in Minnesota then thinking about what's going to happen now that Blacks are emancipated if they move north.
It didn't matter that the Black community in Duluth was only 0.5% of the population. Bill Green told us it never mattered how many Black people were in any town. They were always seen as a threat.
There was a lot of talk among white property owners that the smaller numbers of Blacks moving into Minnesota was an indication of a horde about to move in.
In the end, Harry and Clementine didn't stay in Duluth for very long.
In 1913, and this is 4 years after they moved to Duluth, they leave, and they head south to this bigger city with a bigger Black community, Minneapolis.
And Eric wanted to know, what were Harry and Clementine walking into? Was Minneapolis any more welcoming than Duluth? To find out,
he went to talk with a woman named Kirsten Delegard. She's an historian who specializes in race and housing policies, especially in Minnesota. She runs the Mapping Prejudice organization.
So just to be clear, in 1910, Minneapolis is not particularly segregated, nor is St. Paul. And the cities are not unique in this regard. This is true of almost every American city in this time. Like at the beginning of the 20th century, they are not particularly segregated.
But she said right around the time that Harry and Clementine moved to Minneapolis in 1913, all that was changing.
I mean, there's this whole so-called science of the real estate industry that's emerging at this time, where you have real estate economists developing these models that are saying, oh yeah, if there's one Black person in the neighborhood, it brings down the property values this amount. I just want to be clear, this was not based on fact in any way. You read a lot of the press and the interviews with white people in this period, and that's what they'll say. They're like, you have to understand, like, everything I own is in this house. And how dare these Black people come in and try to attack the value of my house, which is all I have in the world.
On top of that, real estate developers specifically had their eye on the southwest corner of Minneapolis. It's a lovely part of town. There are a couple of lakes, there are a lot of parks, there's a nice band shell for outdoor concerts, and those developers thought it was ripe for upscale development exclusively marketed to white residents. But there were already Black people living there. So Eric asked Kirsten, what did the white residents in that part of town do to their Black neighbors? And Kirsten told him about this one family who was living in southwest Minneapolis around that time.
The Myrick family, Mary Myrick, owned a house which was a home for her extended family. She was a domestic worker, and neighbors pledged to come together and say, we will not give her any work, and we will make sure that she doesn't get any work, so she will be forced to leave because she will not be able to afford to stay in her house.
Kirsten said Mary Myrick held on for 8 years before she was forced to sell her house in southwest Minneapolis. So in 1913, when Harry and Clementine were moving down to Minneapolis, they needed to pick a place to live.
The first time that we see where they're living is in 1915, and they had found a little apartment, a duplex, on the south side of the city, south of downtown.
Kirsten said it was several blocks away from the southwest neighborhoods where there was growing racial tension.
It's considered the very desirable, stable, integrated neighborhood with good access to parks that people use a lot.
I presume that Clementine was still doing beauty work at this point, and I know that Harry was a waiter. And one of the things that surprised me is how many jobs were off limits to Black men in that period. And there's like studies to show that. You know, you see waiters, porters, barbers, janitors, elevator operators. You know, these are mostly jobs in service. Occasionally you'll see someone works for like the post office. But it's very limiting of what you could do.
We don't know what Harry's experience was like, but in this old recording, a man named A.B. Cassius talked about his experience being a waiter in the 1920s.
When I went to the Curtis Hotel to work as a waiter, I was very discouraged because they only paid $17 a month wages, and if you caught you with any cream in your coffee, they charged you a nickel, and if they caught you with a pat of butter, you had to pay a nickel, and if you broke a glass, which in waitering you're bound to break some, that was all deductible, so there was no way for you to get $17 a month. So each payday for 2 weeks you drew about $6 or $7. If you didn't make any tips, you didn't have anything.
Today, that would be about $100 every 2 weeks.
I discovered that the white waiter downtown at the Radisson and the Nicollet and the Minneapolis Club, the athletic club, they were all paid $75 a month. And I said, this can't be right.
Today, that would be about $500 every 2 weeks. The pay discrepancy was remarkable between white and Black waiters. Harry and Clementine were probably struggling financially, but Eric found an announcement in the newspaper that signaled everything was about to change for them.
And it was in the Appeal newspaper, and it's dated November 4th, 1916.
Madam C.H. Robinson has been appointed body masseurist at the St. Barnabas Hospital under Dr. Farr.
She's working for Dr. Farr. Dr. Farr is not just some doctor. Dr. Farr is a pioneering, very sort of high-tech, eccentric guy. He's playing music in the surgery room, which was very innovative at the time. He's actually innovating in anesthesia at the time. And he was also taking motion pictures of some of these surgeries. And you can imagine he's also thinking like, okay, and the other thing I'm going to do is when the patients are done, we're going to very carefully massage their wounds and so that they heal appropriately. But again, the guy is like on the cutting edge.
When Eric told historian Bill Green, he was impressed.
Black women with that kind of role at a hospital, a white hospital, that strikes me as noteworthy. This is important.
Clearly, it allowed Clementine and Harry to have enough financial stability to say, okay, we're going to stop renting. We're actually going to buy a house.
This is a big deal. This is when Clementine and Harry bought the house that now belongs to Eric. In order to get all the details, Eric reached out to a woman named Penny Peterson. She's an historian who also works with the group Mapping Prejudice. She specializes in analyzing historical property records.
She found the original ad in the newspaper from 1916.
Stop paying rent. Nice little 6-room house with 3 bedrooms. Near Nicollet and 2nd, Carlines. Can be bought of owner for $3,000 cash and $35 a month.
Today, that $3,000 would be more than $70,000 for the house, with a monthly payment of roughly $900.
Since Eric also bought this house, he can imagine all the features Clementine and Harry probably loved about it.
It's not a big house. It's very cottage style. There's a beautiful small stained glass window in the living room. There's arched passageways between the rooms downstairs. There's big bay windows up in the bedroom upstairs. There's a big clawfoot tub, which, I sit in today and think about how we all sat in this same tub, but nobody wants to hear that.
So in 1917, Harry and Clementine bought the house. Maybe it was the clawfoot tub that really cinched the deal.
And even though they have this steady income, they don't have sort of a nest egg to put into a house. So they buy the house on a contract for deed.
And that made Penny Peterson say, uh-oh.
So contracts for deeds are bad. You don't get the deed until you've paid off the entire house. If you miss one payment, you'd lose everything. Back in those days, as is now, you could have a big balloon payment that you somehow have to put together. And that's where people often lose it.
It's clear that Harry and Clementine were taking a big risk when they bought this house, partly because of what Penny Peterson said about the contract for deed, but also because of something Kirsten Delegard pointed out about the location of the house.
So the Robinsons' house is sort of in this contested zone in the years after they move in.
And what are the
In other words, they were now going to be living in southwest Minneapolis. That's where the Myrick family lived. That's where Eric's house is.
By the way, I didn't know any of this history, but the census data shows us that there's more than 6,000 families who are living there, and only 9 of them are Black. And it was one of those areas of the city where white residents are starting to target their Black neighbors.
So why buy this house? Why take this risk? Eric asked historian Bill Green.
It's an investment, the challenge that the African American faces is acquiring property, getting wealth in that way. We don't necessarily want to integrate, but we want better property.
That's one reason. But Bill Green said there's also another reason. This house was a signal that they were part of that aspiring middle class, with their lives splashed across the pages of the Appeal newspaper.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, actually. The leadership of the Black community at the end of the 19th century took efforts to kind of embrace the trappings of middle-class status, which was how respectability was defined in the larger world as well as in the Black community.
For Harry and Clementine Robinson, buying this house was a signal that they were worthy of respect. But now they had to keep it. The Robinsons bought their house in a predominantly white neighborhood in southwest Minneapolis in 1917. That same year, the United States entered World War I.
Industrial jobs are suddenly opening up a little bit. You know, these jobs that we were talking about that were closed off, they're starting to loosen up. And so Harry landed a job as a furnace man at an ammunition factory that was run by the Minneapolis Steel and Machinery Company. And for a little bit there, I thought, was he just adjusting the temperature of the machinery company? No, he's actually running these fiery hot furnaces that are helping with the heat treatment of shells.
We don't have any information about how Harry felt about working in the plant, but we did find this recording of another Black man who had the same type of job at the same company years later during World War II. His name is Albert Allen. In this recording, he described his first day on the job.
I can't help but laugh, thinking I didn't know what I was going to. It was a shawl plant. And I walked in. Oh, it was a dirty, filthy thing. I think today about pollution. Oh, my gosh, what that plant was doing to individuals. But that time, there's no one concerned about just get those shells out. As I was walking down, I had on my nice little blue suit that I wore, and I'd been going to school, and just as clean as I could be. And I was walking down with the foreman, I could see all these fellows sitting up on the shelves and all this dirt around. So I walked.
Eventually, Allen began work on the furnace, just like Harry.
That furnace was cockeyed hot. When you'd walk down this aisle, the average individual coming in the plant, he'd have to walk at least 50 feet from it because he couldn't stand the heat. I ended up with a challenge by working right there at the door. It shows you how a body can make an adjustment.
You know, I've seen pictures of these guys, and their clothes are torn and dirty, and they're dipping these ammunition cells in hot oil, essentially. This is not pleasant work, but it's still an opportunity.
Harry Robinson was 37 years old, and this was the first job he had where he wasn't serving people. But historian Bill Green said Harry was probably still working as a waiter. This work on the furnace in the munitions plant was probably his second job.
Most blacks who were of the middle class, basically the husbands had one or two jobs because the jobs that they were normally able to get a hold of paid menial wages. They were sometimes porters and janitors and waiters at the same time.
Bill said if Harry could bring in two incomes, it would free up Clementine to participate in social clubs.
The men, their status was their inability to allow their wives or to afford their wives to participate in club activity.
And that's exactly what I saw in the newspapers. It was like, whoa, there's a lot of social activity happening in the house, and it really starts right around this time, 1917 into the early 1920s. You can see them all over the Appeal newspaper, but other black newspapers that are publishing at that period.
Mrs. Lagrinia Williams of Winnipeg is visiting Mrs. Ed Hall of St. Paul. Mrs. Harry Robinson entertained her last week. Mrs. Ida Sellers recently organized the Phyllis Wheatley Literary Art Club with Mrs. Clementine Robinson, vice president. Mrs. C.H. Robinson, West 39th Street, entertained at dinner 16 guests on Christmas Day.
Clementine was also being celebrated for her work.
Mrs. G.H. Grenier of Moose Lake, Saskatchewan, who has taken her treatment, says, "They are wonderful." Madam Robinson is the only one west of Chicago using the thermoelectric medium.
I want to give you a little space here to savor this moment. They made it. I mean, they still had to do some really tough jobs for a living, and there was probably no extra money lying around. But their life, spread across the pages of the Appeal newspaper, was the picture of middle-class black excellence.
This is when I started to realize that something significant had happened in the house. They've been sort of scraping by for years, working in jobs, the only jobs that are available to them, which are very limited, and yet they've been able to get this far, which is sort of extraordinary.
But we know that the next year things would begin to change. The summer of 1919 is also known as Red Summer, red as in the color of blood. It would go down in the history books as one of the most racially violent seasons in the 20th century. Historian Bill Green gave us the details.
I believe there are as many as 40 cities that saw race riots throughout the nation, mostly in the north and in the east, and occasionally in the far west, in California.
These cities included Chicago, Omaha, New York, Washington, D.C., among many others. And Bill told us this rioting included something not often seen before. Black people were arming themselves and fighting back. This was just after World War I had ended, and black vets had returned to the United States with a new sense of entitlement. Edward Nichols was one of them. He was a black man who grew up in northern Minnesota. In this old recording, he talked about his time in France as part of the U.S. Army, and then what happened when he came back to the States.
Well, when we arrived in France, I was a young man, 17 years old. Now here, we were pleasant people, and we wanted to be friendly. And these people, they wanted to be friendly, too. And we had money, and we'd buy their wine and fraternize with them, and they liked us very well. Things were pretty good. You could go in any theater or anything. But when I come back to France, I took my girl to the theater, and the girl in the ticket booth says, well, you can go in, but you have to sit down front, the front 3 rows, or go up in the balcony in what they called heaven. And I resented it very strongly, but these were things that happened while I was gone. Yeah, we had quite a bit of trouble there.
Bill Green told us there was a widespread sense that people were fed up with this kind of discrimination, and they were fed up with having to be compliant and polite.
And it all sort of contributed to a sense of blacks drawing the line, and that caused a reaction. Blacks standing up created a sense among, the white power elite. This is a real threat here.
The riots of 1919 did not spread to Minneapolis, but people in the city definitely knew about them. I found an article in the Appeal newspaper, and it was reprinted from a Chicago newspaper called the Chicago Herald and Examiner.
It was dated September 27th, 1919. That would be the fall after Red Summer.
Because our time of rioting is over, some people think the sky is clear again. No idea could be more foolish. So long as we have discrimination, unfair treatment, a feeling of brooding injustice between the white men and colored men, we shall have a burning fuse on its way to high explosive.
In Minnesota, that high explosive came the next year, in 1920. That's when a mob of white residents in Duluth lynched 3 black men.
This was front-page national news across the country, including the front page of the New York Times, because it was a triple lynching in a northern city at a time when a lot of people were sort of wagging their fingers at the South, saying, okay, you guys got to cut out this lynching. And in a prominent black newspaper in New York, the New York Age, James Weldon Johnson, who was a leader of the NAACP, he said, the truth about this incident is Minnesota has turned out to be as bad as any southern state could be, which is a very sort of damning accusation about Minnesota at the time.
Edward Nichols, that soldier who had come back from France, was in Duluth the night after the lynching. He talked about it in that old recording.
The next night after the mob, the white people said they were going to run all the out of town. And we decided that we'd just barricade ourselves in our house. And I was the only one who had a gun. I had a .45 Colt automatic that I brought back from the war. In the night, the sheriff, and there were quite a few concerned white people about our welfare, wanted to make a relationship with us, but we decided to go it on our own.
And then there was a knock at the door.
So I put on my raincoat, and they had these pockets that go through the Army raincoat. And I put the .45 Colt automatic down in there and cocked the trigger back, and I went to the door. And there was a white lad out there, and said, what you want? He said he had a telegram from Western Union, but if he'd have stamped his foot, I'd have murdered him. We were that tense, yeah.
When it came to Harry and Clementine, we already knew that many of the white residents in southwest Minneapolis didn't want their black neighbors. But Red Summer had emboldened these neighbors to escalate the situation.
I found this article in the Minneapolis Tribune from November 16th, 1920. And this really is like the bombshell story that puts a fine point on how intense the neighborhood tensions are at that time.
The headline, Negro Question Causes Protest. Residents of 13th Ward object to members of race as neighbors.
And I should say that Southwest Minneapolis includes the 13th Ward.
It goes on. Protesting against the presence of Negroes or persons of Negro blood as residents of the 13th Ward, 200 men and women held a meeting at 43rd and Pillsbury Avenue last night in the South Central Community Club rooms.
Eric says this meeting in November of 1920 had a clear objective.
So these folks are saying, we want to get rid of this handful of black families who live in Southwest Minneapolis.
After Eric read this, he realized the meeting was just 5 blocks from the Robinsons' house, what's now his house.
And this isn't sort of just some random assortment of people. This group was very influential at the time. There were 2 leaders of the club. One was a man named James McMullen, and the other one was a man named Ewan Cameron. Ewan Cameron, around this period, would get elected to the state house. And James McMullen, who is the chairman of the meeting, he is a real estate agent. And this is sort of just along the lines of what Kirsten said, that real estate agents play a really important role here of sort of driving this segregation.
I can only imagine what it felt like to be singled out like that and targeted by 200 of your neighbors. It's chilling. So what can Harry and Clementine do? That's next time.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Streets.mn podcast. Ghost of a Chance comes to us courtesy of the Minnesota Star Tribune. It was reported by Eric Roper and produced by Melissa Townsend. The music you're hearing now is by Eric Brandt and the Urban Hillbilly Quartet. We're always looking to feature new voices on the Streets.mn podcast, so if you have ideas for future episodes, drop us a line at podcast@streets.mn. Streets.mn is a community blog and podcast and relies on contributions from audience members like you. If you can make a one-time or recurring donation, you can find more information about doing so at streets.mn/donate. Find other listeners and discuss this episode on your favorite social media platform using the hashtag StreetsMNPodcast. Until next time, take care.